and what he does as Dylan Gabriel, quarterback for Oregon, they'll probably look at it and give him a little bit more credit than they do to Genty.
Yeah, and that was great that Oregon wins the game, but I would say Dylan Gabriel is probably the first Heisman candidate that worries me a little bit for Ashton Genty, partially because of why we like Genty to win the Heisman, because Oregon probably favored in the rest of their games until they hit potentially the Big Ten championship. Oregon's probably the favorite to win the Big Ten now. And Gabriel, that was his announcement to the Heisman stage on Saturday, was that win against Ohio State. He played great. That was a phenomenal game in Eugene. So I would say that that's really the first Heisman candidate that enters the stage that worries me a little bit for Genty. Now, I just don't see a scenario where if Genty keeps rushing for 206 yards a game, how do you give it to anybody else?
It would be tough to do, and I think the voters realize that, and they recognize that. I think, we talked about in the past how quarterbacks have run this thing, run roughshod. The truth is Carson Beck is playing okay. I mean, he put up 400 yards passing versus a mediocre Mississippi State team. Honestly, outside of him, I can't really. Miller Moss, they lost again. That was. USC lost again. So honestly, Dylan Gabriel playing on the number 2 team in the country, potentially number 1 team. We'll see how Quinn Ewers does the rest of the way when he comes back from injury. But I would say those two, your number 1 and number 2 teams in the country, they're quarterbacks for those teams. That's probably who you're looking at right now is probably being the biggest competitors to Genty. But, they're surrounded by 5-star talent. They are. We can talk to Brandon about this, but just loaded. Whereas Ashton Genty's not. Now, the argument is he's not playing against. He doesn't have 5-star around him, and he's not playing against 5-star talent. So do you punish him, or do you just kind of let it be a wash? I'm telling you, he's doing superhuman things at this point. Superhuman.
Yeah, without a doubt. And it was kind of a pedestrian game a little bit for Boise State out at Hawaii. It was a late kick. I mean, not a late kick for them, late kick for us. 9:00 local time kick, but I would say out of all the games that Genty's played so far, that was probably the team that held him in check the most. And he scores a long touchdown, still right at about 200 yards. But
he did it. But he only averaged 7 yards a carry, and that was the difference versus averaging double digits. And they did it. They bracketed him, and they wanted Madsen to beat him with his arm, and he did. He could. They just played a really soft. They ran a 3-man defensive line. Hawaii did. They would bring a linebacker up to the line of scrimmage, but they would rotate and rover him back and forth, basically just spying Genty the whole time, daring Madsen to beat him with his arm. And 28-14, it's fine. I mean, it was a win, and it was never in question if you're looking at it from a team perspective. But he also had to run the ball for over 30 carries to get to that 200 yards.
Yeah, he did. And that was, I think, the first time that he eclipsed that 30 carry mark, which kind of shows you the hand that if Boise State is nervous about a game, he's going to touch the ball 30 times.
He's their closer, right?
Yes,
you talk about baseball. You put your best guy in at the end, and that's give him the ball. And, the other thing, too, that I think that we haven't even talked about is ball security. With touching the ball that many times and people knowing you're going to get the ball.
Almost did lose a fumble. They had to overturn it at replay.
Right.
Almost did lose it, but
right. But in terms of the amount of for 1,400 yards rushing, and the guy has not lost a fumble yet. That's pretty dang good.
Yeah, that's pretty incredible. That's got to be something that NFL scouts too are keeping an eye on. He just kind of continues to climb that ladder. So. Ashton Genty, another great performance at Hawaii. He continues to be the favorites to win the Heisman Trophy. Colorado's Travis Hunter did injure his right shoulder against Kansas State last week, is expected to play this week. This is my concern with Travis Hunter that we didn't really talk about last week. There's an injury history there with Travis Hunter. So what happens if he misses a game or two down the stretch? He's playing a lot of snaps, two-way player. We've never seen anything like it, but got to be on the field to win a Heisman Trophy. And he was in and out of the game last week against Kansas State, is expected to play this week, though. Boise State obviously off, but they'll get back into it at UNLV, probably the biggest game of the year to this point for Boise State next Friday.
So, you know how with your gas tank, if you fill up your car, they say the first half of your tank is bigger than the second half of your tank, right? That's kind of the analogy that they use. Well, it's the opposite in college football. The second half of your season is bigger than your first half of your season. It's how you close it out. So, for as amazing as that first half of the season has been, he needs to just keep, Ashton Genty, speaking of Genty, has to keep pace and keep par on the second half of the season doing what he's doing. If he does that, I think he has a realistic shot. The biggest problem that we're looking at right now is you start seeing these other guys, Dylan Gabriel, now is playing week in and week out. It's a high pressure situation to win the Big Ten. It's a high pressure situation to see how far you go into the college playoffs, where you get ranked and seeded. Do you get a first round bye? Those are the types of things that the voters are going to start paying attention to. So that second half of the season, it feels like Gabriel, I mean, he came from Oklahoma, had a phenomenal year last year. He moved in. It feels like he's just now getting acclimated to that Oregon offense.
Yeah. Quickly, we'll wrap up our thoughts on the Boise State-Hawaii game. Boise State, this is the second time this year that this defense has gotten 8 sacks. 8 sacks against Hawaii, 8 sacks against Washington State. The Broncos lead the nation in total sacks with 29 through 6 games. By the way, the team that's second in the country right now, San Diego State, coming to the Blue the first weekend of November. So something to keep an eye on as well. So, all right, let's go ahead and bring in the man that everyone is here to listen to talk, and that is Brandon Huffman. So welcome in, Brandon. Brandon with 24/7 Sports.
Hey, thanks for having me in, guys.
Brandon, thanks for coming. Long time no chat. Actually, hardly ever chat, but good to have you, my friend.
Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Well, good. Hey, we're talking all things Idaho, and we go from like the high school level up, right? So we don't necessarily talk about who's playing who this week or whatever, but we talk about the recruiting. I mean, that's such a big part of why these kids play the game and what they're doing. And you're located in the Pacific Northwest. You've been able to see a lot of these kids for a long time. And what are your general thoughts of football in Idaho at the high school level going to the next level?
Yeah, I think it's gradually improved to the point where there's not just 1 or 2 guys, to the point where there's now multiple guys. And you've got years where you've had multiple 4-stars in the state, and those guys are now already impact players at the respective schools that they signed with. And you're seeing more and more schools. I mean, we've seen it with Jax Tanner, and we've seen it with Calvin Aboy, in the 2026 class, national programs, Duke coming into the state and offering a kid this week, Michigan coming into the state and offering a kid this week after already having a guy sign with Michigan, with Gatlin Bear getting Alabama and Georgia. So you're seeing it grow from a state that was more of a regionally recruited state to a state that's now being recruited nationally, and multiple guys being recruited at that level on a yearly basis.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I look at it as, the population of Idaho is just blown up in terms of, people moving in. Specifically, we're calling it from that 2019, 2020 time on.
Mm-hmm.
And I point the finger at California, Washington, and Oregon. A lot of those transplant kids have come in and elevated the game of football in the state of Idaho.
Back in the day when Andy Avalos was still the head coach at Boise State, we had him on our podcast in 24/7 Sports. And, he talked about the difference in Boise from when he went there as a high school recruit in the early 2000s to coming back as the head coach. And he said, went from being our secret little getaway in the early 2000s to now where, like you said, there's families that have moved there from all over the West Coast and, specifically into the greater Boise area. And as a result of that, you've seen the football really start to blossom. You see the amount of players blossom. And I was doing a podcast earlier today. We were talking about that in Arizona. And one of my colleagues at 24/7 Sports, Bud Elliott, he did a story a couple of years ago about kind of the dwindling numbers of recruits in the state of California in comparison to maybe 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. But as a result of that, the rise in Arizona and Nevada. And so you're seeing, Arizona and Nevada kind of benefit from Southern California's demographic change to now you're seeing it in Boise, and you're seeing those states in the Northwest, they're heading further east. And as a result of that is allowing Boise to have quite a few players to get recruited. And I think you're going to continue to see that trend up as cost of living increases in certain parts of the Western United States and it stays at a much more manageable level in other parts. You're going to see a continued growth in football, and especially, I looked at the kind of the resurgence in the state of Washington, and when you saw a lot of those classes in the late 2010s, in the teens to the early 20s, well, that kind of coincided with those kids starting to play football in fourth and fifth grade when the Seahawks were winning the Super Bowl. And obviously, Boise doesn't have, and Idaho doesn't have an NFL team, but when you've got a team like Boise State that's been consistently good, but now you're back on that national lexicon. You're hearing about Ashton Jeanty all the time. That gets young kids inspired to play football. And when more kids are getting inspired, more kids are getting opportunities to play at the next level.
Yeah. Hey, Brandon, watching this Thursday night game right now, Denver and New Orleans. Taysom Hill not playing tonight. Jonah Ellis, another Idaho guy, linebacker for Denver. What I guess is in your idea, what is Idaho's brand of football? Ryan and I talked about it on this show a couple times. We think it's just blue collar players that coaches just love. Coaches have to find ways to put them on the field. What do you see as like that's an Idaho kid?
You hit it right there. I mean, like Tal Johnson goes to Utah and he's starting in, a blue collar defense for Utah. When you play Utah and you play on that defense, you've got to have an edge to your game. You got to have that nastiness to it. Well, Jonah Ellis had that. Obviously, he's got a long background with his dad being a first round draft pick and a longtime NFL guy and a college coach. It's the lunch pail guy. You go back to the Shea McClellans, you go back to, the Leighton Vander Esch. I mean, just keep going back. And even when Boise State was winning with Kellen Moore and with Titus Young and, Austin Pettis, you still knew Boise State for their defense and for how physical they were, with Ryan Clay just destroying guys up in the trenches. And you look at some of those great players that have made that transition from college to the NFL that were Boise State players. It's been on the defensive side of the ball. Pete Kwiatkowski, Jeff Choate, guys that have spent time at Boise State as assistants, as coordinators. They've taken that blue-collar mentality with them at their other stops. And so, even look at Colston Loveland. I mean, when you think tight ends in the modern era, you think these are the divas, these guys are the overgrown receivers. Well, no, if you're playing tight end in Michigan, you're going to be a block first, catch the ball second type of guy. You better be that old school, very little tape on your wrist, the neck roll, the guy that, thrived in the 90s. And that Kenyon Sadiq, I mean, there was a play the other night, if you watch the Oregon-Ohio State game, where Oregon had missed the PAT. And, if Ohio State runs that PAT back, it's 2 points, and that game comes down to 1 point. Well, Kenyon Sadiq goes down, runs down, and he kind of alters the return and keeps it from Ohio State getting any points. And, Kenyon Sadiq's a guy that you look at, and he's that physical presence on, Oregon's offense as a pass catcher, as a blocker. And so I think it is. I think that extends into the whole state, where it's looked at as that kind of that blue collar, kind of that big sky, what you would expect. Those guys that just work hard, first to punch in, last to clock out type of players.
Yeah. Last year's class, I've been in Idaho for 10 years now. By far the best class I've seen come through. Is that the best class that's ever come through Idaho?
We're talking the 2024 class or the
the one that just
Yeah, and I think obviously it gets skewed a bit because of just how good Gatlin Bear is and just how much attention that he brought to the state, and and the caliber of schools that were coming after him. But you go and you look at Rakeem Johnson starting game 4 as a true freshman at Michigan State in the Big Ten, and so you look at the talent in that group, and then the top end talent is really strong. Guys that I think, Trevor McKenna could have been a offensive lineman or a defensive lineman at Boise State. They bring it in from one side of the ball. And so that top end group, but, if I'm looking back, if there's a class that I kind of want to, maybe say that, hey, this class was kind of sneaky good for, the amount of talent it is you go back to that 2022 class. And, you've got Colston, obviously, who's starting at Michigan. He's a potential first-round draft pick. But Tal Johnson, I go back to what he was able to do and what he can do. And, and the type of player that he had to be to play early at the University of Utah. And so, think about that. You got 2 or 3 years there, and then we don't even got into the 26 class, where you're going to have, Kelvin and Jax right now that are both being recruited at a high level for 2 linemen. And so yeah, that's a class, but it's trending up. It's not like it was a unicorn class that it was good that one year and then it kind of comes back to the mean. That's what you want to maintain, and that's what you want coaches to keep coming back for when you can now have 4 or 5 classes where there's national caliber players in each of those classes.
Yeah.
So I got to jump in here. I did some analysis 10 years ago. Recruiting's always been one of my hobbies. And 10 years ago, I did this analysis. And what I did is I took 24/7, the rankings and the recruiting classes, and I took it per state population. And then I took the recruits. And I just wanted to see for how many people did they pump out a recruit, like a potential kid that could go out and play college football. And now I don't have all 50 of them here, but the top. Anybody want to take a stab at the top state out of you two? What do you think? Top state.
I mean, hasn't it historically been Mississippi? Like per capita has had the highest amount of players.
You're close.
I think
Alabama.
Okay,
Yeah,
which makes sense.
on. Mississippi's number 2. You're right.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and their ratio for every 39,000 residents in Alabama, they pump out a college recruit for every 39,000. Texas, which you would think, oh my gosh, it's got to be phenomenal. Well, yeah, I mean, they have the most college recruits out there in terms of total numbers. Their ratio is 84,000 for every 84,000. A sneaky good one, and Brandon, you and I chat about this at one point. Utah has for every 53,000 they pump out a recruit, and then Idaho comes in at every 72,000. So I don't know if that's an indictment of, hey, we just don't play good enough football, or there's not enough competition to elevate it, or if there's just not enough people to choose from. But at the end of the day, you can see, and by the way, that Idaho number compared to the 10 years back has decreased. So it's gotten better over the time period. It was at 100,000. Now it's down to 70. What did I say? 72,000? Yeah, it's down to 72,000. So you can see trend wise. And to your point, Brandon, that is moving in the right direction.
Yeah. And I think that's one thing that you're going to continue to see, kind of like as the census are done every 10 years, you're going to see that trend change again as people are changing the locations of where they're raising families and where they're playing. And, it's funny because I mentioned with the Seahawks surge that you would have thought, with Washington, Oregon has been a national brand for the last really 20 years or over the last decade. And yet, it seems like there's less players coming. Oregon's one of the states that I cover, and there's less players coming from the state of Oregon. They act like they're Florida, Georgia, and Texas. They're not, but there's less players. And so even when you think, okay, this makes sense, this correlates with an increase. Well, in Oregon, basketball is big. Track is still big. And there's some states where it's like it's never going to be the prominent sport. And, less players are playing in some states, whereas the game is growing in other states. And, it's also fascinating to me as we've seen the increase in flag football for girls flag football at high schools. You're seeing that in states that maybe you wouldn't have expected for it to be as big. And whereas, in the states you would expect it to be big, it's not as prominent. So, it's the statistical analysis are going to be very interesting over the next 10 to 15 years of the increase in tackle football opposed to maybe the increase in flag football.
Yeah, you could run the mean on that. My niece she's a sophomore at Shadow Ridge High School in the Phoenix area, big high school, like 4,000 students. I mean, we call our high schools big here, and we have like 2,200. It's our 6th day, right? You go down there, and it's all of 4,000, and they're a state ranked team. But I guess flag football girls flag football has blown up in the state of Arizona. California's starting to play like in some of these states that I had no clue or there's no rhyme or reason for it to go off, but it has absolutely grown. And to your point too, a lot of that are the transplants, the Californians that moving east, and those kids like my brother and his family, they're from Utah originally, moved south. They're not locals, right? They're the ones that are playing the game.
It's what's interesting too is now this past summer, for example, I was down in Florida for Future 50 at IMG, and it's sponsored by the Under Armour All-American game. And in years past, when they brought the top 50 players, it would be 30 skill guys, 20 linemen. Well, this year they got rid of the linemen and they just focused on, top 30, 40 skilled players, but then they brought 40 girls there as well. And since flag football is going to be introduced in the 2028 Olympics in Los Angeles, you're seeing a huge emphasis being put in by the shoe companies and by sporting goods companies to grow the game of flag football. And you're seeing it grow. You're seeing it become a sanctioned sport in a lot of states. You're seeing some states that are still resistant to it, but you're seeing other states that are fully embracing it and diving in, and it's fascinating to watch because there's been so much discussion over the last decade, 12, 15 years of player safety issues in college football, in the NFL, and in high school. And is that why there's a decrease in youth football? And, I think one thing that's going to resuscitate the youth football movement is the possibility for NIL when you get to college. And so all of a sudden people are going to be like, you know what, never mind. Let's go back to playing football because that payday might come sooner without even having to play professionally. And, does that filter over, into flag football? Does flag football ever get the market? But what it is it's growing the game to a demographic that it necessarily wasn't growing to previously.
Yeah. My brother has 4 daughters. So he's all invested. Flag football, That's his jam, He has one son, but he'll never play football. So point is, if he's going to be a football dad, he's a flag football dad.
Absolutely. It's a lot less equipment you have to pay for, too.
Yeah, right. Hey, kind of going off your last point of NIL, transfer portal, I'm sure you get asked this 1,000 times. What on your end on the recruiting side, especially, I'm kind of curious to your job. How do you keep track of all of this now?
Yeah.
Guys are changing and decommitting all the time now. We saw it with Gatlin Bear.
We used to joke the day after signing day in the old days was National Unfollow Everybody on Twitter Day. I got you through your recruitment, you made your announcement, you're off to college, I'm done. Now you got to cover their second, third, fourth, fifth recruitments. And that sometimes before they even sign with their college out of high school. Then you got to cover the ones out of the portal. And, it's funny because I work for a media company and, content is king. And that is fantastic content. We talk all the time now that I think a great case in point is last December, I was down in Nashville on the day that the transfer portal opened. And we had done a signing day show in early or mid-December. The third Wednesday of December had been the early signing period. And, the interest in signing day has waned as the interest in the first day of the portal being opening has exploded. And, I woke up, I think it was 5:30 local time. I had to be at the studio at 6:30. I woke up at 5:30 in the morning, Nashville time, to the news Kyle McCord had gone into the portal. And I broke the news on our show that Aiden Childs was going into the portal. And the average fan, as they're often sometimes referred to as casuals, they don't necessarily know about the high school kid that's from Fruitland, Idaho, or the high school kid that's from Fresno, California. But they all know who Kyle McCord was. They all watched the Ohio State-Michigan game. It was the most watched game of the regular season last year. They know who Aiden Childs is if they were paying attention to Pac-12 football. And so the portal has become so fascinating because fans are now looking for that one-year get-rich-quick kind of feel, that scheme that, hey, if we just get this one player, we would have done a great job. And case in point, if you watch the national championship game with Washington and Michigan, the majority of the Washington team that played in that national championship game, the Braylon Trices, the Jalen McMillans, the Roma Dunzes, were homegrown players. But the guy that took them from being a 4-8 program under Jimmy Lake to a 25-win team over the next 2 years was Michael Penix. He was throwing to homegrown guys. He was being blocked for by homegrown guys. But he was not a homegrown guy per se. And he took that. And so you saw with Ohio State this year, they got the good chunk of their players to come back, but then they go out of Caleb Downs. They go out of Quayshawn Judkins. They go out of Will Howard. And maybe you're 3 or 4 pieces away from a national championship. It just happened to be a quarterback, a running back, and a lockdown DB. And the portal has now allowed you to get rich quick. It's allowed you to get healthy quick. USC in 2021 was 4-8. The year later, Lincoln Riley comes in with a whole myriad of transfers, and their 1 second half meltdown against Utah in the Pac-12 championship game from going to the college football playoff. That's how you can get rehabilitated very quickly. And now you throw NIL into that, and you're going to get healthier even quicker if you're offering, substantial resources, if you will, to get a player to come. And so the portal you're covering, and even then you could have a guy that transfers in the portal. He goes in December, he transfers in January. If he's not getting that NIL package, he's out of there by April. He's somewhere else by September. So it's this constant moving part, but like I said, it's fabulous content.
Content is king, like you said. Absolutely.
Yeah. And kind of the flip side of that we've touched on a little bit on this show is I think the transfer portal, if a smaller school like an Idaho or like a Boise State does it right, you can actually go and get maybe a higher level recruit and say, come play here. I'm not saying play here for 4 years. I'm saying play here for a year. Come win the Big Sky, go on a deep FCS run with us, and then go transfer somewhere else. You can do that, or you can sit on the bench at a Oregon State or a Washington State, something like this. Do you see that at all?
100%. And there was a great article that Bruce Feldman did in The Athletic right after the Oregon-Idaho game. And he said how the NCAA transfer portal had a direct impact on that game. We have Dylan Gabriel playing quarterback at University of Oregon. Now, remember, Dylan Gabriel went to UCF out of high school, transfers to Oklahoma, was going to go to UCLA. Then Caleb Williams bounces from Oklahoma to go with Lincoln Riley. So all of a sudden he goes to Oklahoma. Then he ends up at Oregon. All right. So that helps them. But the whole point was if Idaho has Giovanni McCoy instead of him playing at Oregon State or the running back who I believe went to Washington State, then that game maybe ends up at a different result. And Jason Eck had a great line in there, and I'm paraphrasing it a bit, but he's essentially said, we know where we stand. We know as an FCS program where we stand. If we can get 2 years from these guys, that's great. If we can get a third year, that's even better. But we also know that if they do really well here, there's a chance that a bigger school is going to come. And, they had a stud linebacker there last year, X3 Alexander, who had was an Arizona State commit to Herm Edwards. Arizona State fires Herm Edwards. New coaching staff comes in. They replace the linebacker. He doesn't end up at Arizona State, ultimately signs at Idaho. And his offensive coordinator at his high school, his brother was the running backs coach at Idaho at the time. So he goes to Idaho, has a great year as a freshman All-American. Now he's a starting linebacker at UCF. Playing in the Big 12. And Big Sky schools understand that, hey, this might not be what we are. We're almost the old school JUCO. If we can get 2 to 3 years out of you, but and I've said this for years, the Big Sky is the best FCS program in the country, largely because there's only 2 conferences at the FBS level in the West, with the Mountain West, and I guess, traditionally with the Pac-12, the Mountain West. You go down to the South, you go to Florida, you could have teams in the American Conference, the Sun Belt, Conference USA, ACC, and the SEC. All right. But you come out West, those kids that might have been, if there was another conference playing football out here, like in the days when you had the Pac-12, the Mountain West, and the WAC, or even the Big West, now, those kids are choosing, hey, I don't want to go I don't want to go to Wyoming. I don't want to go to the Air Force Academy. I'll go to Idaho. I'll go to Montana State. And those are 4 teams that are in the top 10 in the FCS. And so those schools are going to be able to replenish because they're going to be able to punch above their weight when it's coming to signing those guys, but they're going to understand that they're still an FCS school compared to the Mountain West and the Pac-12 schools, or now the Big 10, the Big 12, and the ACC, which are out West, and holding on to those guys. So I think you're going to continue to see those schools get really good players, but they also understand they're probably going to lose those players if they have any kind of success.
Yeah, you mentioned JUCO, and that's the first thing that came to mind. And I went to school in an era when JUCO was really heavy. Snow College was, and they're still around, but Dixie College was a big one down in Utah. Ricks College here in Idaho, which is now BYU Idaho, and they pumped out that talent. And so that was the pathway and the runway to get to a bigger school. And now with that NIL and the transfer portal and the ability to go different places, you start to see teams do that. Now, my big question is, and this is what I thought, I've seen some flames, right? Flame outs. They come and they grab somebody from the transfer portal. How, if you're a coach, and I mean, obviously you need to know your player, and it's the old Bill Belichick thing, right? He drafted a bunch of players, but he was more interested in what the players did from the other teams. He's infamous in saying his scouting report was from the other players and when they were coming up at the end of their, at the end of their contracts. Well, it's kind of the same thing now. How do you know what they're going to do and how to fit it? And then how do you recruit that if you're a coach?
If you watched Florida State this year, that's the danger of relying on the portal so heavily. All right. They had so much success a year ago with the players that they got out of the portal, the Keon Coleman's, the Jared Versies, guys that really thrived coming out of the portal. So they thought, hey, we can go back to the portal. Well, DJ Uiagalelei's been a disaster there. A lot of their other portal players have been a disaster. And so it is a case-by-case basis. USC relied on it heavily when Lincoln Riley first got the job. And then, they got some guys out of the portal the next year that weren't up to par. Chip Kelly thrived off the portal early on. Then he was getting really bad players out of the portal, but thought, hey, I don't want to go recruit. Let me just get guys out of the portal. And so that's the thing. You can have a guy that maybe you think, all right, he's doing really, and that's a lot of times the danger of going after Division III, Division II, FCS guys. That jump is still a jump, and not everybody's going to be able to make a Cam Ward-like surge. Now, if you paid attention to Washington State the last couple of years, Cam Ward didn't necessarily set the world on fire his 2 seasons at Washington State. He was good. Was he worth $1 million that Miami's getting? Well, right now they're a top 5 team in the country, and they're getting a lot of value out of it. But for every Cam Ward, there was a Dakota Pruka who went from Montana State to Oregon and got benched midway through the season. Also didn't hurt. They had a true freshman named Justin Herbert that went there, but they thought, hey, we got Vernon Adams to do really well here. Let's go back to the portal, and it didn't work. So for every successful Bo Nix, Michael Penix, type, there's a Phil Jerkovic, a other transfer who goes somewhere and is a monumental failure. So you got to really be able to nail the evaluation, but also understand the chemistry and understand it too, that what's coming along with a lot of these portal players now is the higher NIL. And a lot of times I've been pouring my blood, sweat, and tears into this program for 3 or 4 years. This joker's coming in for a semester and he's getting paid how much? No, F that. That's not happening. And the anger and the lack of chemistry comes as a result of that. So you've got to be very delicate, which is why you're seeing a lot more schools go into that NFL model and that front office style management of personnel directors, recruiting directors, general managers, and making sure that you're budgeting it right, but also making sure you're managing those egos just as well.
Tom Brady, and he was on, and I can't remember which show it was, but he's talking about college football programs are now college football teams. So he was talking about the decline of quarterback play at the NFL level. And I quite frankly see it. If I'm watching NFL Sundays, they get these kids or these guys who come in and yes, they're athletic and yes, they can throw the ball. They have, rocket launchers attached to their bodies, but the cerebral element of the game, I feel like, is being diminished. What I'm seeing, high school level, they're demanding more. So those high school quarterbacks are getting ready to be college ready as they're coming out of high school. They get to the college level and then they're put on a college team. And then they may be bouncing 2 or 3 teams by the time they're out and getting to the NFL. Tom Brady makes the argument. He says these kids were not in a program anymore. They go to a team. And so the development, there's this lack of development. Whereas in high school, and you get a few transfers here and there, but for the most part, you get stuck in your program and you grow up in your program. You learn the offense and how to play. And then you start seeing it. And that's what I'm seeing. I see quarterback play is declining at the top end. We'll call it the top half. SEC, the big power conferences into the NFL, it's declining. But the lower half, we're talking high school all the way. We have an NAIA school here, College of Idaho, and Andy Peters played at Boise State, the quarterback, and he's a phenomenal athlete, and he's just picking on kids out there in the NAIA, and so his quarterback play is elevated. But that top end, to me, feels like it's starting to come down.
You're seeing, there's a running joke kind of in the industry. It's like, if you didn't transfer 3 times in Southern California as a quarterback, did you really play quarterback in Southern California? And now that's trickling up to the collegiate level. And, DJ Uiagalelei is at school number 3. All right. You've got a JT Daniels who starts out at USC, then ends up at Georgia, then ends up at West Virginia, then he ends up at Rice, 4 schools. And there's this need, I grew up in an era. I remember when I was a kid, UCLA had 5 different quarterbacks play quarterback 5 straight seasons. They were seniors, guys that waited until their 4th year, 5th year, senior year. Those days are done.
Gone.
The quarterback's not waiting. And I hear this complaint all the time. Well, he's afraid to compete. That's why he's leaving. No, he's not afraid to compete. He wants to compete, but he's not going to be able to compete because you're only playing one quarterback at a time. So he's leaving to go somewhere that he can play. The problem is they're not sticking around long enough to be developed, and that's why Miller Moss was so celebrated and lauded when he got the starting job at USC this year. In year 4, he decided to stay put and wait his turn and become the guy in year 4. But guys like that are kind of an anomaly. But because the flip side of that, you look at Michigan, and their quarterback situation is a complete disaster now because they didn't go for the portal. Jack Tuttle, I guess he was in the portal, but he walked on. but he's in his 7th year. Alex Orji wasn't the guy. Davis Warren wasn't the guy. They haven't done a great job of recruiting quarterbacks, and they stayed away from the portal. And so, guys aren't sticking around in programs long enough. And at the same time is, if you get one quarterback, that's really all you're focusing your time and attention in. You're developing and evaluating all your quarterbacks, but you're developing your one quarterback who is your guy. And so those younger guys aren't getting the action. And so you're right. I mean, the NFL has had mediocre starters in half the league for eons. So why is it a surprise that, 80 college teams have very mediocre college or quarterback play and only 20 have good ones? Because then they get to the NFL and that guy who might have been the 21st best quarterback, he's still getting drafted because you need other quarterbacks in the NFL, but he wasn't that great to begin with in college. So why should he be that great, when he gets to the NFL?
Yeah, it's a trickle up, trickle down. Quarterback play is a disaster, except at the high school level. I have seen better high school level quarterback play within the last, we'll call it 10 years, as they continue and the offenses and the schemes become more complex and they get more specialized coaching.
I think that's a great kind of segue I want to make too. Being a great high school player, whether it's a quarterback, a receiver, running back, does not necessarily translate to being a college prospect. Being a great college player doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be a great NFL prospect. And I always use the analogy, a friend of mine, head coach at University of Hawaii, Timmy Chain, all-time leading passer in college football history, didn't get drafted, didn't play in the NFL. But he set records in college, playing in the run and shoot. Well, he was a great college quarterback. That didn't necessarily mean that he was going to be an NFL guy. And I always go back to my first show in this job in 2003 and going down to USC and spending time with Pete Carroll, who at the time was in, I think, his 3rd year at USC, hadn't won a national championship, won it a few months later. But he said, Brandon, you watch football all around the country on a Friday night. Quarterbacks are throwing touchdown passes. Running backs are rushing for touchdowns. Receivers are catching touchdowns. Offensive linemen are blocking and getting pancakes. D linemen are getting sacks. Linebackers are getting tackles for losses. DBs are getting interceptions. It happens at every game you watch in the country. But that doesn't mean all those guys are going to be playing on Saturdays. I might watch a guy put up 1,000 yards in a season. That's great. He's doing his job on Friday night. Doesn't mean he could play a down for me in college. There's a lot of guys that are great college players, but they're not going to be NFL guys. They are who they are. And so you're seeing really good high school players, but college coaches, their job is to determine what are the guys that are going to be good college players, not just good high school players. And I hear this all the time. Well, nobody's going to have a bigger heart than my kid. Yeah, and college coaches will tweet all that great stuff about, I want the kids that are dogs. No, you don't. You want the most talented, the biggest, fastest, strongest, and the most skilled. Okay. At the end of the day, we make a joke like, hey, you know what? He's got a lot of red flags. Yeah, but can his, talent outweigh those red flags? Because if it can, he's going to play. And the guys that aren't necessarily the quickest, the fastest, the strongest might be the hardest workers, but those are what we like to call a lot of times backups and walk-ons and scout team members. And so at the end of the day, it's still about talent. And so, yeah, you're seeing a rise in the ability and the talent and play of high schoolers. But for a lot of them, that's kind of the peak, is that high school career.
Yeah, and kind of to bring this back home a little bit here to, kind of tie it back into some of the kids that have come out of Idaho the last few years. Colson Loveland's obviously the biggest name that we have in college right now. What do you remember about him being in high school? What do you remember about that recruiting process? Were you surprised that a school as big as Michigan was looking at him?
Keep in mind at that point, Michigan was scuffling. There was a lot of questions if Jim Harbaugh was the man for the job. And when he committed to Michigan in the spring of 2021, Michigan was coming off, I think, a 3-5 season during that COVID year. They had canceled the game with Ohio State, but he had been, what was he to that point, 0-5 against Ohio State. And they were flagging a little bit. And I remember there were some folks like, why in the hell are we going to Idaho to recruit a tight end? We're Michigan. We should be able to get the best of the best. And I remember, coming out to Idaho the weekend he ended up taking his official visit to Michigan. I went out there for what's now known as the Gem State Showcase, but it was the Rare Showcase. And he had kind of hastily scheduled that official visit to Michigan, but he had visited Arizona, who had just hired Jed Fish. He had hired Arizona State, which was coming off, just being busted for some recruiting sanctions. and Oregon State, where Jonathan Smith, who had experience being in Boise as the offensive coordinator for Chris Peterson. And then Michigan was kind of like, one of these kids is not like the other. The one thing that Colston really had going for him, we had a couple things, is during the COVID summer, I actually saw him in Seattle come out for a 7-on-7 tryout with FSP, which was the top 7-on-7 program in the Northwest. And he had come out, and I got a chance to get eyes on him. And I went back and said, hey, dude, this guy's going to be a 4-star when it's all said and done. But the most important thing is that Idaho played football that fall of that 2020 season. So when junior film was scarce for a lot of guys in that 2022 class, because football was either not played their junior year or played in the shortened spring, he had a head start on a lot of guys going into that spring of 2021. So when the recruiting restrictions were lifted, he had some film. And I think that and what he showed what he could do from a blocking standpoint, from a pass catching standpoint, kind of, escalated him. So he was we were the first ones at 24/7 Sports to name him a 4-star. And, that was coming from small town, Idaho ball. And really, the phrase "their best ability is availability" really comes to mind. And I think about, Jackson Dart was pretty under recruited going into his senior year. Well, he played in the state of Utah, and same thing with Zach Wilson. Nobody really thought Zach was going to end up being a top 5 pick, but BYU was playing games way earlier than the Pac-12 and the Mountain West were during that 2020 season. Well, Jackson Dart played a full season his senior year. So having that fall, whether it was your junior or senior year, getting that film gave you an advantage. And when coaches were just looking for anything to recruit a guy off of, to evaluate, well, you have this big guy in Colston, who's 6'5", 220 pounds, and he's putting up really good film. And there's a lot of guys in that region that aren't playing. That gave his recruitment a bump. And then he gets to Michigan, and he's making plays in the game against Ohio State as a true freshman, and just continue to escalate it. And, he's a guy that can thank Idaho for playing ball that fall, and more importantly, getting out himself on the road to get seen by as many as he can in an era or in a time when no eyes were really getting out to see people. He got seen and kind of changed the trajectory of his future.
Oh, I hadn't heard that before. That's such thanks for coming on the show. I love that. That's awesome. I'll kind of pitch the same question to Gatlin Bear last year. When did he really, and I guess Coastal Lovin probably helped, because there's a kid in and playing at Michigan from Idaho, same head coach, right? Different high school. But when did you really see his recruitment take off? And other than him just breaking every single sprint 100-meter, 200-meter record in the state of Idaho, what jumped out besides his speed to you?
So I saw him.
It was the 10-1-5. It was the 10-1-5.
Yeah, it was even before that. It was before, in the spring of his sophomore year, I had seen him at a tournament. In fact, he was inside Bronco or Albertson Stadium, and he dropped 2 wide open passes that would have won this 7-on-7 tournament for him. And I'm like, God, this guy can run, but he's got to learn how to catch the ball. And then I saw him that summer at the Gem State Showcase. And it was only 2 months since that 7-on-7 tournament. His pass catching looks so much better. He looks much more of a natural receiver, but he still had that speed. So he moved to a 4-star at 24/7. Again, we were the first ones to make him a 4-star. I got out to see him. By that point, it had been the 3rd time. Then he had a really good junior year. He had the good track season, but he had a really good junior year. And then his whole recruitment kind of just took off in January 2023. I saw him at a 7-on-7 tournament in Seattle. He was taking like 3-yard slants and outrunning the entire defense for 40 yards to score. Then in February of that year, he goes and he runs, I believe, the 6'6" 60 at an indoor meet, but he beats Roger Pleasant and Nicholas Harbor. And then he starts running those hundreds times, and it's like, okay, this guy's not a novelty. This guy can catch, he can run, but you can't run like that unless you're Gatlin Bear. There's very few guys that are running at that level. And then he just continued to get better. And then it was the All-American Bowl in San Antonio in January where he earned that 5th star, because it was like the knock was, look at the DBs he's going up against. He's not going up against the DBs that Jeremiah Smith's going up against in the same class, that Ryan Williams is going up against in the same class, that Cam Coleman's going up in this same class. He's going up against a bunch of guys that are going to be, like the old NCAA commercial, going to be going pro in something besides sports. And then he goes to San Antonio and does it against those same DBs that Jeremiah Smith was, that Ryan Williams was, that Cam Coleman was. And then that's when he changed the entire trajectory of Idaho football. And so the whole, well, if he played in California, he'd be a 5-star. No, honestly, if he'd been playing football in California, he probably wouldn't have been a 5-star because we're used to speed down there. But it was the dominance of which he showed, the speed with the ability to catch the ball, to get open, that I don't care where he was from. He was a 5-star at that point.
Yeah, and obviously he's taking a 2-year mission. Now, I've always been curious, does taking a mission matter at all in recruitment? Is it good, bad, neutral? What are your...
Let me speak to that because I did do 2 years, all right? I'm going to tell you right now.
Yeah.
My legs were dead. I was in Brazil for 2 years. I walked around for 2 years, and I came back, and it took me... Nowadays, the rules are different. So you can go to gyms, you can exercise a lot more. There's a lot more leniency now. You can actually have contact with coaches. You can do a lot of things, your companion at the time, you can throw a ball. You can do a lot of different things. When I was there, but it's the same thing. I didn't play a down of football. Not one down of football for 2 years. I liked football, talked about football. I talked to other Americans about football, but my legs were dead. And it took me a good 5 to 6 months to get those back, to get any kind of spring. I couldn't dunk a basketball when I got back. I couldn't. So to your point, I think nowadays, coming off a mission, these freshmen that come back off of a mission, they do have a better chance because they're going to be in better physical shape. But at the end of the day, you just haven't touched football at that type of setting for 2 years.
I don't know if you guys know who Ben Criddell is. He is a radio guy. And so Ben and I had this conversation with him a year ago when we were kind of discussing about Gatlin being a 5-star. And I had asked him, because if you're a 5-star, that means we think you're a potential first-round draft pick. We think you're going to be among the first 32 players picked in the draft. That's why there's 32 5-stars, because there's 32 first-round draft picks. But I had to do a little project for me, and it had been since 1999 was the last time a returning LDS missionary went in the first round of the NFL draft. Not just for BYU, but just a returning missionary, period.
Rob Morris.
Rob Morris, offensive lineman, linebacker. And I think the year before there was an offensive lineman who was also at BYU who went in the first round as well, who was a returning missionary also. And he was from Southern California. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but it had been that long. And, I remember when Tanner McKee went on his mission. He was a 5-star quarterback, and he came back, and he's never looked right. And that part of it was because Stanford was on such a downward spiral by that point. He didn't have the Stanford, the early David Shaw years or the Jim Harbaugh years. He had the David Shaw put it into autopilot at that point. But there had been, plenty of guys that had been returning missionaries that still got drafted, that still went on to play at the next level. Xavier Suafilo was the first pick of the second round of the 2014 NFL draft. Started as a true freshman All-American UCLA, goes on his mission for 2 years, comes back. Right when Jim Mora gets hired at UCLA, ends up being really the linchpin recruit for him, and goes in the first round and plays in the NFL for 9-10 years. So the correlation's hard. I think a lot of it's positional. I think a lot of it's where you end up from a collegiate standpoint, what school you end up, And I remember when Ben Olsen went to BYU, and then he went on his mission, came back to UCLA and played in the prevent offense that Carl Durrell was running as the UCLA head coach. Well, maybe he was better off going and playing at BYU, although by that point, I think Bronco had already taken over at BYU. And, it's a mixed bag. And I think it's so much of it is just where you end up in the position that you play.
Well, the other thing too we have to remember is that Gatlin's brother is a triathlete in Arkansas. So athletically, I think, and it's tough to say brother, it's going to be
two SEC track brothers.
2, by the way, yes. My point is, I think that athleticism will carry over. He's in Argentina. Gatlin's in Argentina. They eat a lot of meat in Argentina. I don't think that nutrition will be a problem for him. It'd be different if you were like Philippines or something like that. So I think the athleticism, but if he, again, you talk about the coaching staff, and what are you going to be able to do with this kid when you come back? Because let's be honest, he's coming back raw. He's going to become back raw.
Yeah, I had a coach tell me too. like, hey, if Gatlin Bear comes back a half a second slower when he goes on his mission, he's still a 10-6 kid. That still means he's freaking fast. So if he gets slow, he's still faster than 99% of the guys that are signing with Division I schools.
Fair.
So, that's why you take a guy like him. Like, dude, I don't care if you want to go to Mars for 2 years and you have space legs when you come back. You're still going to be fast. You're not just going to become slow all of a sudden, especially when you're hitting into the prime of your life. So that's the thing. Like, a lot of times your talent will trump any worries that may exist if you are away from the game for 2 years. And like you said, now that they can do more of the physical activity, that only helps.
Yeah. How did Boise State get his original commitment? And did the Avalos firing have anything, I'm sure it did, have anything to do with him not going there?
It was trending away from the Broncos even before Andy was fired. It was interesting. He was on an unofficial visit to Oregon the weekend that Boise State did fire Andy. So that already told you he was already kind of trending away. But by that point, there had already been enough of the red flags with the offense, is this going to be the right fit for him? Is this going to be the right spot? He was all in on Boise State. When he committed, that was huge. And Andy really played up, hey, stay home, play for the Broncos. And Matt Miller did a fantastic job. Bush Hamden did a fantastic job. They all kind of worked together. But by the time he was, I wouldn't even say he was getting cold feet. There was just the worry, is Andy going to survive the year? We are past that season, not survive the year. And you've got, at that same point, Oregon's a hot commodity again. Their only loss at the time was the Washington. Michigan was a top 2 or 3 team. So it wasn't like they lost him to, some school that they had no business losing him to. You were losing to 2 top 5 teams at the time, 2 teams that were either playing, potentially going to be playing for a national championship and ultimately winning a national championship, by the way, with the guy that your high school coach had just coached and was starting on that team, or to the school that's got one of the best football track combos, a coach who is recruited in the state of Idaho, who had gotten Kenyon Sadiq, who he played 7-on-7 with the year before, who had, and Junior Adams one time told me, he's like, Huff, there's nobody who does a better job recruiting wide receivers than me. And you look back and he had Cooper Kupp and he had, he got Cooper Perry in this class. He got Gatlin last year. He's had Kyler Castle before that. So, Boise State was losing him to 2 teams that were hot, trendy programs with positions that had a nice little history. So you move Gatlin 200 miles south and he's living in Utah, 200 miles east and he's living in Montana. Boise State's not even in the conversation. So the biggest thing that they had going for them was proximity.
Yeah, I thought it was cool. I got a chance to call a high school game when he was right before he had committed early in the season. And I think he had just committed to Boise State. And Burley was playing Valley View in a game at Albertson Stadium. And it was like the 3rd play from scrimmage and he caught a touchdown. And it was like the perfect call, wrote itself of visions of what you're going to see later, right? But then he ends up going to Oregon. So
hey, you know what? But I'll always say this: he gets back from that mission. Does he still want to go to Oregon? I mean, you would think so. I mean, they could be coming out. They could be playing for a national championship this year. But you spend 2 years away from home. Maybe you're like, you know what? I kind of want to go back home. Or maybe he goes to Oregon and becomes a star there. But I wouldn't entirely rule out Boise State, especially if the Broncos keep cranking like they've been doing right now. I mean, right now the Heisman Trophy front runner is in Boise, not in Oregon.
Right.
Yeah, but the number 2 is in Oregon, and
don't let facts get in the way of my great analogy I just made right there.
All right, my bad. No, you and I texted about this a little bit, but I could see after 2 years a BYU in play for Gatlin Bear as well. I know he was adamant about not a BYU, but I'm telling you, man, after those 2 years, BYU sounds really good to a lot of these guys who are coming back. That said, he has a good head on his shoulders. He'll make the best decision possible for him.
Yeah, and I think that's, with the way college football is going anyway these days, I mean, he might go to Oregon for a year after he gets back and then be like, you know what? I do want to go to Boise State. I did want to go to Oregon. I want to sign, but now I want to go back home. I mean, that's the thing. The game has changed so much. And, one of my favorite things about the transfer portal is people will be like, we don't want that kid in our, if he can't hack it here, let him leave. But they are embracing those transfers that come to them. If you leave my school, you're soft, you're afraid to compete. But if you left the school that their fan base thinks you're soft, but no, you want to compete because you're a dog. So it's like, nobody can make up their mind.
Is the game better or worse now because of it?
I mean, it depends on what your interpretation of better, consists of. I Thought that the Georgia-Alabama game was one of the most fun and exciting college football games that I've watched in recent memory. And then Oregon-Ohio State said, hold my adult refreshment. And it was a fantastic game. I think the game is great. I think it's more fun. I think there's more parity than there's ever been. I don't think football has gotten worse. I don't think college football has gotten worse. I think, people worried that with the 12-team playoff that the regular season wasn't going to matter. Well, I watched 2 games in the last 3 weeks that were fantastic football games that were regular season games where the loss still hurt Ohio State. It still hurt Georgia. All right. Now you got to be perfect the rest of the way. And now Georgia's got to go on the road to Texas this weekend. Now Ohio State still has to play, Penn State, and they still got to play Michigan. That pressure is on Ryan Day. That pressure gets on. And so I don't think it's hurt. I think it's made it fun where you can sit there and granted the championship game 2 years ago was horrible between Georgia and TCU, but I can't believe we're in an era where TCU made it to the championship game. Where it wasn't Alabama Clemson again. It wasn't the same 3 or 4 schools, Georgia again. You're getting some new blood in there, and I think it's fun. And you're seeing that really in college basketball where, we had a Final Four last year that included Alabama, that included NC State. Purdue finally got there. The year before that, you had San Diego State, and you had Miami, and you had FAU in the Final Four. And I think college football is probably a long way away from the non-blue bloods getting into it routinely, where you have 4 kind of no-namers, if you will, in the Final Four. But I think, it makes football more fun when it's not the same 5 teams that we're going to expect. We now see 15, 20 teams that may have a chance to play. And I think that makes the game more fun.
I watched UTEP for a minute and FIU last night, and it was awful. I mean,
don't get me wrong. There is some bad football still being played.
And my point is that they're sucking all the talent off of those. Those are the teams that are getting hurt the most. So if you're a UTEP fan, I'm sorry. There's nothing we can do for you at this point. Because we talked about it too, the FCS level, it's great because you can come in for 1 or 2 years, prove yourself. You could be a big name. You're a big fish in a small pond versus being a small fish in a great big pond is what you end up being in the FBS level. But I was watching that, and even my son, my 12-year-old son, he was like, Dad, everybody just looks slower out there. And I'm like, it's because they are. It's because they are.
I mean, to your point, New Mexico State, it was, I watched them play Tuesday night. It went, I think, double overtime against Louisiana Tech. Well, think about what New Mexico State looks like this year if Diego Pavia isn't beating. Think about what college football is looking like this year. If Diego Pavia stays in New Mexico State, they don't beat
Vanderbilt.
Alabama at Vanderbilt. The game is changing. So that's, if you're a Vanderbilt now, it sucks for New Mexico State. It sucks for a UTEP. It sucks for those schools. But if you're a Vanderbilt now, you've got a shot. You've got a chance to compete. Beating Alabama is something that's, attainable. And so is college football good for all 130 programs? Probably not. But it's better than just the 5-7 team monopoly it had been. Now it's 20 to 30 teams.
Yeah. And here's the other thing that I'll just add that this playoff does. You win a Power 4 conference championship or even a Group of 5 championship. The best Group of 5 gets to make the playoff too. Mm-hmm. It's an automatic berth. You're in. Mm-hmm. So look at the Big 12, where there might be 2 3-loss teams playing each other in the Big 12 championship. That is certainly on the table. Mm-hmm. Where that probably gets a first round bye.
Yep. And keep in mind here too that right now the team that I think is the front runner for the Group of 5 playoff spot, Boise State, is a field goal away from having beat the number 2 team in the country right now. And everybody's emphatic that Oregon is the number 2 team in the country right now behind Texas. Boise State gave them a run for their money just like Ohio State did. But because it was Boise State and not a blue blood like Ohio State, that loss, doesn't look as glamorous. Well, now a few weeks later, all of a sudden people are like, dang, Boise State kind of did that thing to Ohio State. So Boise State's not necessarily going to be the tough out because you got to figure if Boise State gets in, they're going to screw the Group of 5 team. They're going to be the 12th seed, even if they don't deserve to be the 12th seed. Yeah. And that means they're going to play the runner-up of the SEC championship game. Okay. The reality is whoever it is, whether it's Georgia, Alabama, or Texas, if Ohio State beats Oregon in the Big Ten championship game, if Georgia beats Texas on Saturday, and then, you have Alabama playing Texas for the SEC championship game, the loser of that game is going to be the 5 seed. Boise State's going to have to play an Ohio State or an Oregon, or they're going to have to play. But if the committee does what's right, Boise State's a 10 seed, a 9 seed. And now that's a very winnable game against the 8 seed. And maybe they get the 8 seed. They're not going to get a home game because, again, we're going to screw the little guy here. But if I'm a defensive coordinator, do I really want a game plan for Ashton Jeanty after a week where I've just gone through a gauntlet of playing? If I'm because the reality is too, the 5, 6, 7, 8 seeds are probably going to be conference runner-ups, or at least a few of those are. I just had to go toe-to-toe with my conference champion in the conference championship game. I now no longer get a bye, and I got to prepare for freaking Ashton Jeanty in my first round playoff game. This is not fun. My team just was demoralized losing that SEC championship game or that Big Ten championship game. And now I'm Boise State, and I just, beat the 5 seed. So, it's going to make for great theater because we've seen how many times, going back to Chris Peterson, and how many times the BCS Buster team won their BCS Bowl. And then I think it was like the first 5 years of the New Year's Six where the group of 5 team won their bowl game. They get up for that game. Yeah. They get up for that game big time. And there's a reason that they went 12-0 or 11-1 and got into that position. So it's going to be fantastic theater. And it's not going to be the upset of like when, whatever Towson State or Murray State, I don't even remember what state, Baltimore, Maryland beat Virginia in the first round of the NCAA tournament.
Towson.
That's there you go. Or 2 years ago when Fairleigh Dickinson beats Purdue. A group of 5 team beating the Power 5 team in the first round of the playoffs is not going to be a shocker.
Well, and look at it, Malachi Nelson, right? He's not even the starting quarterback at Boise State. 5-star recruit coming out of California, right? USC. They were going to hand him the mantle, everything it was. Boise State is not. They can get players. Mm-hmm. It's a certain type of player, but they can get players. And so, to your point, if they come in and say they get that 8-9 seed, they'll probably play, and I'm guessing, Big 12 runner-up. Let's call it Big 12. Maybe it's a BYU. Let's just, for all intents and purposes, I'm a BYU guy, so I'm going to say that. All of a sudden, a BYU Boise State first round, like that is bad blood. And that is a phenomenal theater. And talk about a good time for college football. I mean, to me, that's what it's all about right there.
Oh, absolutely. And, it's why you see when I was watching the Montana-Washington game in 2021. When Montana went in and basically from that game, they ruined Jimmy Lake's future at Washington. And the guy who had 2 interceptions for Montana was a kid from 30 minutes outside Seattle. There was a lot of kids on that Montana team that were from Washington that were never recruited by Washington. And that game meant everything to them. I would see when Fresno State would go down and play USC or UCLA. Those kids at Fresno State weren't recruited by USC and UCLA, so they went to Fresno State. You don't think that game means a lot to them? And so there's going to be some, whether it's unintentional matchups that are going to be very intentionally angry, bitter matchups, and I am here for it.
And because you love content and you love the drama. Let's go.
Yeah. And the reality is what I love about those type of games is that's when you really see how well the evaluation is. 24/7 Sports had Ashton Jeanty as a 4-star. All right. They're going to come out and say he was a no-namer, but that was a great evaluation by Lee Marks. Great development by the 1 year Keith Bonifa had him. And then the last couple of years, you look at the coaching and development, but that was a great evaluation. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, Boise State never gets a kid like Ashton Jeanty from Texas because they're not a name. They're not a name brand. I think back like when Jaquiz Rogers at Oregon State. I was at Scott.com at the time. We had him as a 4-star. All right. He wasn't the biggest guy, but the dude can ball. And so what you really see is how well those coaches evaluate. Because if I have a team, if I'm Boise State, Brian Harsin gave me some guys, Andy Avalos gave me some guys, Spencer Danielson, shout out former Azusa Pacific Cougar like myself, has developed those guys. You really see, and I remember having this conversation with a Power 5 head coach when he was an assistant at a school. Said, my old coach would say, I'm tired of recruiting against you because you have that damn polo on, and that's a more attractive polo than the one that I am. I trained you. I made you the player that you are. And I taught you all this. You come to me and you spend a week with me every year, but that stupid polo that you wear trumps the polo that I'm wearing, and you're going to go get that kid. I still love you, but I'm going to go get it. And I think about how many college coaches are like, dude, I did all the evaluation on this kid. I found this kid before anybody else did. There was the running joke for years that if Boise State would find a kid, a Pac-12 school would sign the kid, because as soon as Boise State offered him, Chris Peterson now told Colorado and Utah and Oregon State he's good enough to go recruit. And they would ultimately get him. But it was like, we were the first ones that evaluated. We were the first ones that signed or that recruited him. And we did a great job evaluating him. Now we're getting these kids, we're evaluating them, and more importantly, we're developing them. And that's where you're going to see. And you look at Boise State, the majority of that roster is experienced guys, 4-year guys, 5 years guys. Ashton's in his 3rd year, but guys that have been and bought into that culture and that program and stuck around for 3 or 4 years. Some of those guys are playing for their 3rd head coach right now. And those are the type of teams that are dangerous come the playoffs, because they have so much chemistry. They don't have the pressure on them. They're going out there with nothing to lose. And those are the teams that are the toughest to play and prepare for when you get into those games, because there's way more pressure there's going to be on Georgia, way more pressure on Ohio State than there is on Boise State.
Yeah. And let's say too that there's talk around town of them being, let's say, an 8 or a 9 seed. Remember, they're an 8 seed. That game would be in Boise. Mm-hmm. And let's say the committee gives them the 12. Now you're going to go put a chip on their shoulder?
Oh, yeah. But make them angry. And you know, I've said this for years. I go on KTIK and I say, you know, the similarities between Boise State and Gonzaga have been from the time both programs really started their arc. Because I think Boise's first bowl game was 99 season. That was the year Gonzaga made it to the Elite Eight. And both have made these, you know, relatively small town in the Pacific Northwest into big believers that they can compete on a national stage. The difference was, you know, with Gonzaga, you only have to get 5 or 7 of those guys every year. You can go get a couple of European players and you can sustain it. But Boise State, the sustained success that they've had, their only year they didn't go to a bowl was the year they turned it down because of COVID. Think about all the programs in college football. There's one other college football program right now that has been to a bowl game every year since 1999.
I have no idea.
It was Ohio State. Since 2000, I think it was. It was Ohio State, because Alabama had some lean years there too.
They did.
And so you look at the consistency of that program, and they had beat the Oklahomas with Adrian Petersons. They had beat the TCUs with Andy Daltons. They had beat, you know, the what was it, 4-0 going into the game this year against Oregon. And an Oregon team that ultimately went to the Rose Bowl when they had the infamous punch, the first game of Chip Kelly's head coaching career. So those are teams that they thrive on playing in those big time games. I remember Pat Hill took Fresno State from this cute little program in Central California to the anytime, anywhere, any place. And Fresno State used to punch a lot of those Pac-12 schools in the face. And I think that's where Boise State is. Like, people could, you know, say what they want and do what they want. It's all fun and games until Boise State punches you in the mouth.
Yeah.
We should put that on a shirt. It's all fun and games until Boise State punches you in the mouth.
Absolutely.
Brandon Huffman, 24/7 Sports.
Well, Brandon, this has been awesome. We could talk to you all night, but we don't want to take up your whole night, I guess. But I will say you were welcome back on this show anytime. You just text Ryan and we'll get you on. This has been awesome. Thanks so much for jumping on with us.
Hey, thanks for having me, fellas.
Hey, thanks for coming on, Brandon. Good times, man. Right. Good times.
Take care, guys.
So, that was Brandon Huffman with 24/7 Sports, just wrapping up here on the Fighting Taters Show. If you want to go back, and this has probably been our best show that we've done so far, but if you want to go back and listen to any of our other shows, you can do that on IdahoSports.com. You can also just search the Fighting Taters Show on Spotify. We should pop up there. You can go back and listen to any of our episodes there. Ryan, that was a fun one.
Oh, it was great.
Yeah, he's welcome back anytime.
Oh, man, I'll tell you. And the insight of some of the things that he's talking about, like, and by the way, how about the breadth and depth of knowledge of that guy? He's naming off names that I'm like, I haven't heard that name in 6 years, 10 years, right? He's just tipping the tongue and just firing away and getting after it. And, you know, it was fun to hear him talk about it. And he's a professional. It was fun. You'd serve him up something. He's like, I can talk about that. You know, it was good stuff and very, very relative and relevant to what we're doing or what we're trying to talk about. So it was great. It was a good time.
Yeah, for sure. So this is one of our first live shows that we've done. We normally record these on Thursday and then they drop Friday mornings. So we are a weekly show, so be sure to check us out. We're the Fighting Taters. He is Ryan Luke, and I'm Lucas Gebhart. We will see you next week. That was fun. Boise State on a bye. Idaho's schedule cooling off. Idaho State trying to rebound from that loss to Portland State. Winless Portland State.
Yeah, that stuff.
Yeah, so. Anyway.
College of Idaho. Look at a cruise.
Yeah. We'll see you next week.